Daf Gimel, and we're in the midst of the conversation regarding um, uh, being careful with one's words and not speaking ill or evil, even just reporting on bad things. So Rav, who was one of the founders of the academies, the yeshivas in Bavel, in Babylon, was a nephew of Rabbi Chia, the compiler of the Brises, the student of Rebbe. So Rav was a nephew both ways, meaning his father and his mother were half siblings of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia had a half brother who was Avu, Rav's father, and a maternal, that was his paternal half brother, and Rabbi Chia's maternal half sister was Ima, who was Rav's mother. Now they were obviously not related to each other, but so was Rav's parents, both of which were siblings of Rabbi Chia. So Rav bar Achva de Rabbi Chia bar Achse. This is the top of Dalet Amud Aleph 4a. So Rav was a nephew both ways. Kisalik lahasam. When Rav came to visit Rabbi Chia, back to Eretz Yisrael and went back from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael to visit, Amar le'eva Kayim, he asked him about his father. Is your father alive? They didn't have a way to report, and so he asked him how his father's doing. Amar le'ema Kayemes. Why didn't you ask me about my mother? Amar le'ema Kayemes. So he said, well, is your mother alive? He says, Amar le'eva Kayim. Did I respond yet about my father that you just moved on? So he realized that he didn't want to tell him that they had both passed, but they were no longer alive. So he said to his servant, I have to sit shiva, and the halacha is that you, as we'll see, that you only sit shiva for 1 day or even part of a day when an immediate relative passes away, but you didn't hear for a long time. That's called a shemua rechoka. You heard the story, but you only heard about it at a much later date. So he said, help me take off my shoes, and take my clothing to the bathhouse. Even though that someone who's in Shiva wouldn't go to the bathhouse, doesn't bathe and in a typical way, and yet he said, go ahead and bring me to the bathhouse. Shmamina tlas. So we can deduce from here 3 things. Shmamina, we can learn that avel asa b'nilas hasan, that someone in mourning, someone in shiva does not wear shoes, leather shoes. Ushmamina shmur rechoka in negas al yamecha. We also learn that a shmur rechoka, when somebody hears about an immediate relative that passed, but it's beyond 30 days. It's a long time since the passing. And so all he has to do is shiva of 1 day. It wouldn't be shiva. Shiva means 7. But he does that level of mourning for 1 day. And also that a part of the day counts as the whole day. And therefore, as soon as he heard, he did some elements of the shiva and then went on to the bathhouse. But again, we bring this mainly for Rav's response that he didn't want to say yes, that his father had died and his mother had died. So rather, he just insinuated it by not responding in a normal way. Hauda Amar. Furthermore, the Gemara now is going to tell us a couple of cases where we see people's manner of speech reflects something essential about them. This fellow who would always say, you know what, let's go ask a judge about this. Let's go ask a law, to find out what the law is. And in all of his interactions was constantly asking for the law. Amru Shmami Nami Dankas. He said, okay, this person must come from the tribe of Dan. The Sifra, it says, Dan Yadin Amo. Dan is a judge for his nation. Israel, like the tribes of Israel. So this person who would, Rashi has 2 versions of what he did. He would either say that he was constantly looking for waterfront for waterfront homes, or he would say that even thorns and thistles on the waterfront are better than beautiful trees and bushes in the city. So Badku, they checked after Mashkachu, the Mizvulun Kasi, they realized it came from the tribe of Zavulun. And about Zavulun it says, Zavulun L'chav Yamim Yishkon, Zavulun will dwell on the waterfront. In any case, you see that a manner of speech is reflective of somebody's essence. So this is the end of the lashon hakiah of clean speech and more being more careful with speech. When we go back to the mitzvah of the Mishnah, the main point of the Mishnah, the mitzvah of checking for comets. And as we mentioned, Rashi says that this is the reason for checking for comets is because the Torah says that not only is there an obligation to remove chametz, tashbisu sa'ar mebatechem, there is also a prohibition of not having chametz found and or seen in the home, in your property. So bal yira'eh, bal yimatzeh. It shall not be seen, it shall not be found. And we have, as I mentioned, tashbisu, the cessation of chametz. Two points that the Torah says. When does this take effect? So the Gemara says, Hasha the Kaimalan. Now that we have the established understanding of the Mishnah, the Kula Alma or Urtu, that the time for, and that everybody agrees that the Mishnah, when it says or light, what it means is that one should check for chametz the evening before the Seder, so a full 24 hours before the night of the 14th. Later we'll see at what time is the prohibition of chametz. Both Rabbi Yehuda and Meir are going to say that it's not before 6 hours, and which is this is halachic hours from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. You divide the day into 12 hours. In Pesach is around spring, so it's roughly a 12-hour day at that point. But the idea is that whatever you go from the beginning of the day, halachic day, to the end of the day, and then you divide the day hours, the light hours, into 12 portions, and the 6th hour would be basically an hour before midday. So v'nivdek b'shis, let him do bedika at that point. Midday is the time that you can bring start bringing the Korban Pesach, which is the time that the prohibition of chametz takes effect. As we'll see later in the Gemara, the pasuk says, "L'sishchat al chametz dam zivchi." Do not bring my Korban Pesach while upon chametz, meaning while you have chametz in your possession. So we see that the Torah prohibitions of having chametz in possession, as well as the obligation of making chametz cease in your possession, which we'll see later in the Gemara. The optimal way to do it is to burn it, according to Rabbi Akiva, but nevertheless, even just bitul belev, just nullifying it in your heart, saying it's worthless and it's dust of the earth to me, is sufficient to consider it non-existent anymore. So that's the time that needs to be done. That's when the prohibition of chametz, of owning the chametz and having it in possession, comes into place. So check right before that. And if you're going to tell me, well, mitzvahs are not done in the last moment haphazardly. They have to be zurizin. They have to be done diligently, makdimin, and they have to be done early with the proper without procrastinating. So nivdik betzafra. So then do it in the morning. And how do I know that you should do it? That mitzvah should be done early without procrastination. The Chsifar, it says, Uvayom Hashemini Yamal Basar Lasa. It says that the mitzvah of bris milah, of circumcision, is on the 8th day. V'tanya Kalayam Kula Kosher Lamila. And we learn in the Brisa that says that really the entire day is kosher for the bris. Nevertheless, is a reason makdim ila mitzvahs. But when it comes to mitzvahs, we are both diligent and we are timely. and you do it as early. Shanamar, as it says, Vayashkem Avram Baboker. It says that Avram got up early to do the mitzvah. So we see that that when it comes to mitzvahs, you don't wait for the last moment, but rather you do it earlier in the day. Now, the reason is we do it at night is one, you want it done at a time that people are home and have the time to dedicate to checking the home. If you do it during day hours, they have work to do and there's other chores to do. So doing it in the evening is when people come home and they have the time to dedicate to clean the house. And also, as we'll see soon, a candle is the optimum way of checking, and that's helpful at night. By day, when you have the contrast of sunlight and candlelight can actually cast shadows and make it more difficult. And so at night, where you can focus your candlelight and look for comets, that's the appropriate time to do. Amar Abaye. So Abaye said, Hilkach, therefore, a student of Torah should not begin his studies that he has on a set time every day. He should not do so on the end of the 13th, meaning that day of checking for chametz, the end of the 13th, even a half hour before the 14th, when he would begin the obligation of checking for chametz. He should not sit down to study Torah. Why? Maybe the studies are going to draw him in, and he's going to be working on a topic, and he's going to be sidetracked and not do the mitzvah of checking for chametz. The next Gemara is going to ask a question about a landlord and a renter. The specific case is dealing with where somebody's renting a space for Pesach that has essentially it's furnished. The homeowner, the landlord, has wares in the house, including his comets, and so the comets belongs to the landlord, but will be in the domicile of the renter. Who needs to check this house? That's the question. It is a struggle in Rashi, Tosfos, and many of the Rishonim to try and figure out what would be the reasons that we should for the question. Why would we think the landlord should check, and why would we think the one living there should check? Essentially, the way Rashi says it, we have to understand a few things. Number one, we just said that the basis for removing chametz, for bedikas, for checking for chametz, is on account of that the Torah says you may not own chametz, it may not be in your possession, and you have to make it cease from your possession. So we would think, based on that, it belongs to the landlord. The chametz is his, the land is his, so the space is his. So it's his obligation to remove it. That's A. B. The rental of a space from halachic perspective, when you rent, obviously the land and the home, the structure, all belongs to the landlord. It is simply the usage of the space that is the right of the renter, and therefore it is still the space, it is still the home of the landlord. So it would seem that it should be the landlord's obligation. It's his chametz, it's his home, it's his property. He should be the one to remove this chametz. Tosfos, as we mentioned in the beginning, is of the opinion that the reason that there's a need to remove the chametz is because maybe you're going to come to eat it by mistake. Since we're used to eating chametz throughout the year, you may come to mistakenly eat chametz, and that would be a good reason to have the renter be the one to check for chametz. But then, according to Tosfos, why would we even think that the landlord should? After all, he's not going to be the one to eat it, and he can just relinquish it in his heart, and that would be sufficient. So it's a difficult struggle. We're going to go with Rashi, and the understanding that we have is that that even though one of them may be more obligated, both of them would have the obligation, because even the renter, even though that it's not his chametz, but it is in his possession, it is something that he would see, and so he has to find it in order to make sure that it's not there. And even though the primary obligation would be the the landlord's, nevertheless there would be an obligation, from a rabbinic obligation, for him to do a bedika, and that's the question. So the Gemara asks, the question was asked of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Hamasker bais l'chaver, somebody who rents a house from someone else, ba'arba asar, on the 14th, and the chametz in the house belongs to the landlord. Al mi livduk, who's incumbent on who is it to do this bedika, this checking for chametz? Hamasker livduk, alamasker livduk dechamir dedeyu, the renter, since it's his chametz. The landlord, since it's his chametz. Or is it on the one living there right now, because it's found within his possession? And as we said, Rashi points out, since it's in his possession at this point, he may come to eat the chametz, and it's there visible to him, so he would be obligated to remove the chametz. That's the question. Tashema. So we try and prove it from the halacha mezuzah. Hamaske b'ayis chavera ala seichel asle mezuzah. That whoever rents a house, it is their obligation to put up the mezuzah, not the landlord. The Gemara says no, that you can't prove it from there. Hasam amarav meshar mezuzah chaves hadari. The mezuzah is actually an obligation of the one living in the space. As the Torah says, that derech biyasa, that when it's on the right side of when you come in, so you see that it is the dweller who comes in and out that has to put the mezuzah up. And as Rashi points out from the Gemara, that mezuzah is there as a protection for the home. And so the one living there is the one that needs that. So it's a chaves hadar, it's an obligation of the one living in the house. But perhaps that's not the concept of bedikas chametz. Bedikas chametz, which is based upon the concept of not owning chametz and not having it in your possession, perhaps that requirement is placed not on the one who lives in the house, but the homeowner. Hachamai, here what's the halacha? Amaluhu Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Tanina, we have a brisa that teaches us something. Hamasker bais l'chavera, one who leases a house to a friend, if the nighttime of the 14th, when the moment that the obligation of checking for chametz sets in, you have not yet handed over the keys. So so then the landlord has to do the bedika because he didn't hand over the keys yet. What's the point of handing over the keys? So Rashi says that's the moment that the person acquires the rights to the home. The renter acquires the rights of the home. And Tosfos questions that because generally it's accepted that in halacha that the renting of the renting of land would require either the payment of money. That would be the moment that it's defined as renting, or shtar, or the signing of the documents, or the or chazaka, or actually moving in. But without one of those three, the handing over the keys wouldn't be the final acquisition. And if you did hand over the keys, and if you did do the others, then the acquisition happens at that point. So there are multiple explanations given for Rashi. Either that there's a concept called situmta, which is if the civic norm for the moment of acquisition of a rental is when you hand over the keys, so then halachically that takes that on as well. Or practically for the obligation of chametz, the time that we're looking at, not your rights to the space, but you're living within the space. The only time that you have, as we mentioned, this is not a real estate transaction in the sense of acquiring the real property. This is a real estate acquisition in the rights of usage of that property. So even if you've acquired it already, the rights to it, but you don't have access to it, the obligation of the chametz checking, which is related to the obligation of not having chametz in your living space, that would only happen when you actually pass on the key and acquire that aspect, which is the rights to actually use the space. And since the key was not handed over, you do not get the obligation of checking. So the landlord has to check. However, once the keys have been handed over, and only then the 14th comes. So then the renter has to do the checking. The next halacha is going to question what's the halacha about when can you assume the home is checked if you rent the house after the obligation of the 14th comes to check the house? Can you assume the landlord has done it? Do we assume that he checked it, or do we assume he didn't check it? And Rashi says on the 14th in the morning, so that this person had the time and the obligation to do the checking the night before. So my nafkamina, the Shaila, the Gemara says, who cares what the assumptions are? Just ask, right? And this is an important halachic idea that even if you have rights to have assumptions in halacha, if you have the ability to ask, there in many cases the obligation is there to check. So the Gemara says the leisa. Now the reason is that he's not around, so we can't check and we can't ask. And now the question is, does the renter who moves in the morning before Pesach have to check their place or not? This is a relevant thing for, say, checking. You rent an apartment for Pesach, go to a hotel, whatever. Do you have to check your space or not? So the question is, do we burden the renter moving in to check for chametz? Rav Nachman Yitzchak says we learned we can ask anybody that would know and they'd be believed. Women, servants, children. This is not a testimony in court. This is just knowledge, and we can ask anybody for that knowledge. My time. What's the reason? My time in a hemne. So why do we believe it? So the Gemara at first says, why do we believe children and servants? Why do we believe anybody about this? How would they know? Must be that the assumption, the working assumption is, the chazaka is that it is already been checked, and therefore we can just believe any information. The Gemara is going to challenge that soon and say, then we're not believing them. We're just relying on the assumption, on the chazaka. So we'll see in a moment. So we now turn to Dalet Amud Beis 4b. Wouldn't you say it's because that we have a chazaka that it's already been checked? So the Gemara says the kasava kochaverim. It's because we assume everybody follows the halacha properly with checking for chametz or removing chametz from their house. Titania, as indeed we have a brisa that says this. Chaver shemeis in regards to tithing. Chaver shemeis. A chaver was someone who had accepted to follow halacha in a clear and diligent way. So a chaver shemes, a chaver that died, and he leaves a silo full of produce. So do we assume that these had been tithed or not? Even if they were harvested or they were brought in that day. We assume that they would have tithed properly that day, because they would not leave their produce untithed, not properly done. So they have a mitzvah to do, they would have done it, and that's the assumption we can work on. So too, with the home, you can assume that everybody would check their home properly for chametz before it. Gemara says, how would you know that? Why wouldn't you say that over here it's not on account of the chazaka, but rather because these people are telling you that it was checked properly? Gemara says, just because a child told you so, that it means anything? So it's not on account of the testimony. Elamai. So rather, what is the reason? The chaskase badak, because you can assume that it was checked. So hay hakol ne'amanim. So why did the Brisa say anybody is believed to tell you that the house is checked? So just say every house is assumed to have been properly checked on the 14th. So the Gemara says you're right. Elamai mishum amira dehani. Rather, it's because of the statement, and we trust the statement of these to inform us, to let us know that it was done. And if they didn't tell us that, then it is we can't assume that it is checked. So it's only on account of the testimony. So let's say that we can therefore establish that it's assumed not to have been properly checked. The Gemara says, really, I can tell you that it is, we assume that it was properly checked. But that brisa that says that we can trust people is when we have reason to assume that they would not have checked it, such as where we know that the landlord wasn't around, or the landlord was busy that day, and they would have had to hire someone to do it. So we have reason to assume that it would be, even though that most people would check it, we have reason to assume that they were not here to be able to check it. And these people come and say, no, we did it for them, or we saw somebody do it for the landlord. And we would have thought, no, since there's a rabbinic obligation of checking for comets on account of the Torah prohibition on not owning and having it cease of being in your possession, perhaps we should not trust them. Kamash Malan, that no, we do trust them. Since it's a rabbinic obligation, even though that it's on the basis of a Torah obligation, of prohibition, and not having comets in possession and the obligation of making it cease to be, nevertheless, the obligation of checking on the 14th at night is a rabbinic obligation. The midaraisa bebitul ba'al masagi, because from a Torah level there is another remedy or another fulfillment of the obligation of making comets cease and not owning comets or having in possession, which is bitul, nullification. And as we talked about briefly at the introduction of the Masechta, that the idea is that if you consider wholeheartedly in your heart, according to Rashi and Tosfos by expression of word, that the chametz is null and void, and according to Tosfos, ownerless to you, that makes it so. And that is the concept of bitul, nullification of chametz. And we make those statements both after checking for chametz and when we burn the chametz. We make a statement of nullification, and that is a Torah fulfillment of the mitzvah of tashbisu, of making it cease. Because elsewhere the Torah tells us when it wants us to rid our possessions of something, such as idolatry, idols, avodah zarah, there it says you have to burn it. And over here the Torah not saying that, but rather saying tashbisu, make it cease to be. It means you have to make it ownerless or make it worthless to you, like the dust of the earth, and that would be a fulfillment. We'll see in a couple of days that nevertheless that's not sufficient, because you still need to check for chametz, because that's the classic meaning of the Torah's obligation. It says you shall not find it in your possession, you shall not see it, and additionally, the Gemara says if you only check and don't nullify it in your heart, you may end up eating some of it if you find, or trying to maintain your ownership on some of it if you find a nice piece of cake or something that you want to hold on to. So there's a need for both, even though that there is a fulfillment that can be had of the Torah obligation by just nullification on the day of Pesach, right before Pesach, or right before the obligation, the prohibition of chametz is really, we'll see soon. But nevertheless, the Chachamim obligated checking so that you not transgress the Torah obligation, the Torah prohibition. Therefore, since this is a rabbinic obligation, the Rabbanan said we can trust people even though that it is difficult and it is a trouble, and usually as Tosfos points out, usually anybody that can do something, we trust them that they did it. And that's the halacha of kol shebiyada. Anything that you can fulfill and you tell me you did, that would be a halachic acceptance of the norm that it was done. And this is the way we trust people that keep kosher to say that this is kosher, and many other halachas that are very intricate, and yet people are trusted for it. Here, there's specific need for a rabbinic trust of those saying that we cleaned it on account of the difficulty of checking for chametz, that it takes a lot of diligence. And yet the Chachamim said that anybody that says that they did it, even if there's reason to believe that the landlord was not around to do it, we will trust them, and the home would be a cheskasar baduk based on their statement that we can assume that they checked it. The next halacha is going to deal with again someone renting a home, but the working assumption was that it was going to be checked for chametz, and they come in and they find chametz everywhere. So clearly it wasn't, right? This is the nightmare scenario. You rent a place, you come in the morning before Pesach, and there's chametz everywhere. And now, instead of having a relaxing after a chametz a day before Pesach, like everybody has, right? The day before Pesach is always a relaxing day. This person now has to also check for chametz throughout this rented space. Can they come and say, you know what, deal's off? I came in, the working assumption was that this would be clean for Pesach. It is not. There's chametz box of Cheerios in the pantry, and there's a loaf of bread on the counter. I don't want this place. I don't want to have to deal with this. I want to back out of the rental agreement. Say, boilu, amasker bais l'chavera. Somebody leases a house to his friend, but cheskas baduk, with the working assumption that it was that it was indeed checked for chametz. Umatzo she'ena baduk, but he comes in and he finds out that it actually was not checked for chametz. Mi hava kemekachtos. Do we say that it was bechazaka? It was assumed to be for chametz. Mi hava kemekachtos, and therefore it is an invalid transaction. A transaction made on false pretenses, and therefore they can renege without penalty. Or not. Now, when did this happen? Tosfos says this must have happened on the 13th, the lease, because on the 14th, indeed, it was incumbent the night before on the landlord to do the bedika, and so that incumbency should still be a legal, a monetary claim from the renter to the landlord, and he can hire somebody to check for chametz and bill the landlord. So this must have been the day before, where the obligation has not yet come upon the landlord, but nevertheless, the assumption was, for whatever reason, whether it wasn't clearly stipulated, but it was still the assumption, and therefore the question is it mekachtos or not. Toshima. So come in here. The Amar Abai said, "Let me boy ba'asad leyavi agra." That no, since this is a mitzvah, the unspoken assumption, even if you assume the house would be clean and have no chametz in there, but since there is a mitzvah that comes on the 14th to do, the unspoken understanding is people appreciate the opportunity to do a mitzvah, not only if in a place where people do it themselves. People do it themselves and they don't hire someone to do it. Because people have an appreciation of doing the mitzvah with their own self. But even in a place where people do pay and hire people for the cleaning and checking for chametz, nevertheless, we say that there is an unspoken understanding that people have an appreciation to do mitzvah with their money as well, and therefore it is not incumbent upon the landlord. It is incumbent upon the renter to do the badika that night when the 14th comes, unless it was clearly written into the contract. Obviously, that would be different. Here, we're just talking about when it was an unspoken understanding. So now we go into the times of when the obligation or the prohibitions of chametz set in. Tanan Hasam. So we have a Mishnah over there. Rabbi Meir Omer, and we'll see this later. Rabbi Meir says, Ochlin kol chamesh. All of the fifth hour of the day, you can eat you can eat chametz. V'sarfim betchila sheish. And the beginning of the sixth hour, so let's call it 11 o'clock, an hour before halachic midday, but let's call it 11 o'clock so that we understand what we're talking about. So there are 5 hours, assuming the day is from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. If that's when the sun comes up and goes down, or from when the dawn to sunset to stars come out, whatever the halachic day is, divide it into 12, assuming that it's spring, so it's exactly an hour each. So let's go with that so that we understand the time. 6 o'clock, the halachic day begins. You have 5 hours of eating chametz till 11, and the beginning of the sixth hour, which is at 11 o'clock, that's when you have to burn the chametz. That's what Rabbi Meir says. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ochlin kol arba. You can only eat the first 4 hours, meaning till 10 o'clock. V'tolin kol chamesh. From 10 to 11, the entire fifth hour, you cannot eat it anymore, but you don't have to get rid of it yet. V'sarfim betchila sheish. At the beginning of the sixth hour is when you have to get rid of the chametz. Now, even though that the Torah prohibition only happens at midday, at the beginning of the seventh hour, meaning at the end of the sixth hour. Nevertheless, since they didn't have a clock, what they had was sundials and they relied on the sun to tell them what time it is. So people make mistakes of what time is exactly midday. And therefore, you need an hour buffer, or according to Rabbi Yehuda, 2 hour buffer, not to transgress this prohibition. The Kuli Alma Mia, everybody agrees, chametz misheshos al malas. From the sixth hour and on, meaning at 11 o'clock, everybody would agree at that point chametz is already prohibited. Minolan, how do we know this? Ama Abaye Trei Kroiksi. So Abaye says there are a couple of verses in the Torah. It says 7 days you shall find no leavening in your homes. So this is the lo yematzeh part. They shall not find it in your homes. You can't, for 7 days you cannot have chametz in your home. And it says however, but bayom harishon, on the first day, tashbisu sa'or mibatechem, you shall remove or cease to have chametz in your houses. And it says, but on the first day. Now, what's clear that it says you remove it on the first day, or have it cease to be on the first day. When is that first day? If it means, first of all, the fact that it says partially on the first day, on the first day you're going to remove it, that means part of the day I can still have it there. And sometime in the middle of that day, I have to remove it. And also the when is that first day that we say you have to remove it? It can't be the first day of Pesach, because if it means the first day of Pesach, that's already a day of prohibition. It says 7 days you can't have chametz in your house. So how can you make it cease on that first day, meaning the 15th of Nisan? Because it already says the entire 7 days you can't have chametz. Must be that Bayom Rishon is the day before, and not the first day of the 7 days of Pesach, but the first day that the Pesach applies. As we'll see, the 7 days are the days of matzah. The day of Pesach is the day of the slaughter of the korban Pesach, the bringing the Korban Pesach to the Mikdash, which is on the 14th day, the day what we call the Erev Pesach, the day of preparing for Pesach, the day that we would bring the Korban Pesach. That was the first day. So on that day, part of the day is permissible to have chametz, part isn't. So we see 7 days you can't have chametz, and on the first day, meaning the day before those 7 days begin, you have to remove the chametz or cease to have chametz at some point in that day. Haketzat. So how do you do this? L'rabas arba'asa l'bir. Must be that on the 14th day you have to remove the chametz from your home. Maybe what it just means is the night before the 14th, the 15th. So the night of the Seder is when you have to remove the chametz. The salkadaita chamina, because and this would work because I may have thought yomim ksiv, yomim in leilas lo. Since it says 7 days you shall not have chametz, perhaps the prohibition of chametz begins in the morning after the Seder, and you can have chametz at the Seder, and that's when you're going to remove it. So the Gemara says, "Lo kamash malan, lo kamash malan filo leilas." So I may have thought that nights have no prohibition. It says no. That's why we need this to tell us even nights are prohibited. The Gemara says, no, I would have no reason to assume that because the obligation to remove chametz is connected to the prohibition of having chametz and of eating chametz, and the prohibition of eating chametz is connected to the mitzvah of the obligation of eating matzah. And eating matzah applies already the first night of Pesach. Obviously, that's the Seder. So therefore, you can't eat chametz. And if you can't eat chametz, you must have gotten rid of it tomorrow as well. Tomorrow morning, we'll go through this last part as well and begin the next daf, which tells us that the obligation of owning chametz and having chametz must apply to all 7 days and nights of Pesach. And therefore, the obligation of tashbisu, making it cease to be, must be on the 14th before the Yantif comes in.